After a fairly straightforward journey, we checked into our hostel, which was Hostel Dodero in Liberia, which even included free breakfast oats. Get in. It was a nice hostel, but we weren't sticking around for long. We were only going to be in Liberia for one night because Costa Rica is so expensive. Well, for budget backpackers. We really had to think about where to go to make the most of our time in Costa Rica. But we still had time for a little wander around the town. Turns out there's not much there. So the next day we weren't too upset to be leaving.
Shuttles in Costa Rica are incredibly expensive, so we opted for local buses, which had premium features like disabled access, a working clock, high-tech armrests, window blinds, and hot air conditioning. The bus journey would continue down the main Pan American highway. Then a separate bus would take us up into the mountains. The midway point was in the middle of nowhere, so we sat and watched the huge American trucks go by and watched iguanas cross the road. The second bus arrived around 10 minutes late, and after stopping in 2 small towns, started climbing up into the hills, which gave us some fantastic views of the rolling hills leading into the rainforest, and to our left the beaches of the Pacific Ocean.
We got to the hostel 1 minute before check-in, which made my inner control freak really happy. And this was by far the most modern accommodation that we've had yet. For just £15 a night, we stayed in Hostel Catalaya, and all around 10 out of 10, and it even came with Netflix. So thank you to the last guest who left it logged in, meaning that we could binge Black Mirror. Also, the first time we've had hot water in the shower for weeks. We were pretty hungry, so we went straight out to a restaurant where Jack had a burger and I had beef casado, which is a typical Costa Rican dish. We'd seen this on Google Maps and we wanted some cheap activities to fill the gaps. So we had a walk down there and we were actually well impressed with it. Have you seen anything like this before? And of course we had to climb on top of it because you can't miss that photo opportunity.
Afterwards we stopped into a coffee shop to taste some of the amazing Costa Rican coffee, and all of a sudden, for the first time in 2 months, it started raining, which made us feel very much at home. Our first big activity was a night hike with one of the local guides, who ran us around the jungle like we were in the Crystal Maze, and got a bit short-tempered when we weren't fast enough to see the animals that he spotted. The first was this kinkajou, which he said was very rare, but according to Google, isn't rare at all, followed by one of the biggest stick insects I've ever seen. He then grabbed a big reed and poked it in this hole, which woke up this massive tarantula, which was soon followed by an even bigger tarantula that we only just got a photo of, and here it is. After that, we watched this green vine snake hunting for food, and you can see its head here. And then found this big glow-in-the-dark scorpion wedged in an old tree trunk. And the evening was finished with this chonky old mop, which really appreciated us pointing our lights at it while it tried to sleep.
The next morning we were up early for another guided tour. We kicked off with a rare stray dog, and we were lucky enough to be able to stroke this one. And then just before the entrance to the main national park, there's a hummingbird cafe where they have tons of these feeders outside and you can just sit and watch them. But they're really fast and they just buzz around your head, so it can be really hard to take a good picture. We had a little hike into the rainforest and it was absolutely stunning, and we felt like we're in the next Jurassic Park movie. It had some of the biggest trees I've ever seen in my life, and they reckon this one is between 400 to 600 years old. They only have 2 seasons in Costa Rica, the rainy season and the even rainier season, so the trees never actually stop growing. So unlike the trees we find in Britain, these trees don't have rings in the inside of them, so no one can really accurately guess how old they are. They also have tons of aerial plants, which live on the top of the trees, and they have roots that hang down, and once they touch the floor, they start to soak up all the nutrients around the tree, and they end up taking it over and killing off the tree, which is exactly what you can see here.
We spent a large portion of our time searching for this bird, the quetzal, which is the national bird of Guatemala. And while searching, we saw a male coati searching for food on the forest floor. But it would do well to avoid this python millipede, which has glands that produce hydrogen cyanide. We were lucky enough to watch this flycatcher feeding its babies in the nest right next to the main path. Then we got to see this violet saber-wing hummingbird, which was also going back and forth to its nest. And just before it was time to leave, we caught a glimpse of the male quetzal, which is distinguishable by its massive tail feathers that can grow up to 1 meter long. And indigenous tribes used to think they were snakes flying through the air.
The next day we got up for a coffee and an almond croissant, and then we found a German Shepherd puppy, which I would have put in my bag if I had more space. It was then time for the next activity, Extremo Park. Here we ziplined through 4 kilometers of the rainforest.
At points going over 600 feet over the ground. And the biggest issue we had, we didn't pay any attention in the safety brief and we didn't know how to stop, which led to some frustrated zipline instructors when we creamed in at the end of every zipline. Extremo Park also had the only underground section of ziplining in Central America, which led to Beth's favorite section,
the Adrenaline Mega Tarzan Swing.
It was at this point I heard Beth make a noise I'd never heard her make before. One more time from the GoPro footage.
We then got back to the accommodation and spotted this. So we made our way to see Texas Dave and were greeted by another German Shepherd puppy. The bar was completely empty, but Texas Dave did a great job.
We'd booked onward travel the next day with a company called Jeep Boat Jeep, and the first issue we had was the first Jeep was just a van, which is fine, but we were sold a lie. We would be driven to Lake Arenal, take a boat across, and then a Jeep through to La Fortuna. En route to the lake, we stopped off for a coffee and these epic countryside views, where we also saw this very small cat sleeping on the roof. We were transferred straight onto the boat and our 45-minute journey began with fantastic views of Lake Arenal and the Arenal volcano, which was partially covered by clouds. We jumped off the boat to get in our Jeep, it's another van, and we were driven on to La Fortuna, where we stayed at Hostel Alpha Arenal, which even had its own balcony. We then ditched our bags and headed out for lunch in town. It turns out the pavements in La Fortuna are partially blocked by these absolutely massive iguanas, so all the pedestrians had to walk in the road, which then blocked up all the road traffic. Thanks, guys.
There's also leaf cutter ants absolutely everywhere, and these ones are carrying leaves back to their nest, which helps to grow mushrooms for their scram. We'd heard about a nearby river that you can swim in, so we walked half an hour there with Arenal volcano as the backdrop. We didn't realise it would literally be underneath the main road, but it was pretty cool in both senses, really picturesque and absolutely freezing. That night we'd booked onto another night hike in the hope of seeing some different animals and insects, and the guide was straight in there with a click beetle, also known as a headlight beetle for obvious reasons. And if you touched it, it made a clicking sound, and he did assure us that doing this didn't harm the beetle. Then we saw a dink frog, a random caterpillar our guide was unfamiliar with. Then we saw a glass frog, and this is a male protecting a bunch of eggs nearby, and you can actually see the tadpoles moving inside. Then with my 20/20 vision I spotted this red-eyed tree frog, and with Jack's 20/40 vision he spotted this annulated tree boa. And then I don't know what type of spider this was, but there were tons of them crawling around in the trees. And then this fat boy is a cane toad, which is poisonous enough to kill a crocodile. And then we saw another unidentified caterpillar. There's over 1,000 species of butterfly in Costa Rica, so it was hard for the guide to know. And then we finished the tour with another glass frog.
The next morning we were up early to visit the Bagarin Trail for another guided tour. 25 years ago this was all farmland, so everything you see has grown since then. The tour started quick with another red-eyed tree frog, followed by a detour to one of the accommodation buildings where a boa constrictor was stuck in the roof. We then headed over to the lake where there were boat-billed herons in the trees, and on a nearby larger tree, right at the start of the trail, we had these white-lined bats, which I can't imagine enjoyed having the guide's torch blaring in their face. The trail had multiple guides communicating with each other, so we quickly moved on to see these two owls with an unusual and unique name, the black and white owl. Beth was on a mission to see a sloth, and the guide was confident we'd see one, which made her very excited. A short while later, the guide somehow managed to see this sloth in a faraway tree, and Beth could finally tick off this bucket list item. This one was a male hanging around on its own, and a bit further down the way we saw this mother and baby sleeping in the trees, followed by this other mother and baby having a good old scratch. Then the trail finished with some free pineapple.
That afternoon we decided to take an Uber to La Fortuna waterfall, which stands 70 metres tall, and you're even allowed to swim in it, as long as you don't go too close. Not that Jack seems to be listening to the rules. And then a bit further away they also had some more pools that were full of fish. We got a taxi back into town and headed straight out for some food. And it turns out the town itself is actually quite pretty. Even the street where the hostel is has a great view of Arenal volcano.
Our final full day in La Fortuna saw us taking another trip into the rainforest to the hanging bridges. over 2.5 kilometers, where we followed a nature trail surrounded by trees and waterfalls. We opted not to get a guide on this tour, as we'd already seen so much on our previous tours, but luckily it was a fairly thin trail. So if we saw one of the groups with a guide looking at something, we just had a little peek over their shoulder. We were lucky enough to see a family of wild boars and a family of coatis, along with a close encounter with 2 motmots. Finishing off with this yellow eyelash pit viper, and a lovely view of the countryside and in the background Arenal volcano.
On the way back to the hostel, we stopped off to visit some hot springs. Again, right next to a main road. And again, with my 20/20 vision, I spotted a Jesus lizard on the rocks, which is the type of lizard that can run on water. So obviously, we needed to see it firsthand. And again. Then that evening we found a place that actually did sausage rolls. So we had a sausage roll and a beer to toast to my last day in the RAF. The next morning we saw this woodpecker waking up our neighbours. And then we packed our bags and made our way to the bus station to make a 5.5-hour journey from La Fortuna to the capital of Costa Rica, San Jose. I'll see thee!